Disclaimer: the information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GAN's processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
And thank you so much, everybody. There's so much that's going on here. It's sometimes we get carried away with many things and we get distracted. The thing is, we have to understand that there's a purpose for our life, and we're not just spending the time idly. We are trying to make the change, and it is not an easy process because it's been a long process. We're talking millennia. It's also, we have acquired a kind of habit. And habits are hard to break. And so the first thing is we do have to have the willpower, but in order to do that, we also have to have the desire. And then that desire stems from the fact, of course, that we have to have the capability to actually do it. And how do we do that? So that becomes the overriding question. So education is obviously very important, and this is one of the reasons the KAKT Foundation has been pursuing these knowledge seekers workshops. I know everybody knows that who's on this panel, but the thing is that this vast majority of the population is totally unaware that we've been broadcasting for 11 years. And so we've been trying on Fridays with the South American community to get this message across, and it's been very successful. And we are trying to do that as part of the KAKT American Knowledge team. So hang on to your seatbelts there, and let's get into it, because this is the KAKT Foundation Spaceship Institute Teachings on Plasma Science. We're discussing the intermediate nanotech. And today's point is the inertia point. And my name is Alexander. I am from Canada. It is June the 22nd of 2025. And this is part of the KAKT Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. So we've been trying to work as an extension of the many years of teaching that we've gone through. And it's been thousands of hours. And as I say every week, that we as knowledge seekers also become knowledge teachers, and we forever have to learn not only how to explain it, but also it would help us explain it if we understood it better. And so each and every time we try and come up with at least a different angle that maybe you can extract something that would be beneficial to you. And so it's in this intermediate nanotech series, we're trying to make it a point. And last week we talked about point blank, and today we're going to talk about the inertia point. And as you can see, this is a point that we really want to drive home. So it all stems from the books of Baron Tavakoli Cash, book number 1, which is the Universal Order of Creation of Matter. And if we look carefully at this thing, there is the center point. But in order to achieve that center point, we have to bring together the matter, the dark matter, and the antimatter. And then once we have that point, then we look at book number 2, the structure of the light, and we see from the cover that there are actually 2 points, and the light goes between these 2 points. And so the purpose of the light seems to be to go from one reference point to another reference point. And the only way they can do that is when these points are actually referring to each other. So where does the discrimination come in? And so that's where we look at book number 3, The Origin of the Universe, and we see that there is a point where the origin of the universe splits up into the sister universe and man's universe. And is that figurative or is that real? So one of the things we do know is that man's universe is very tangible. And we also know that our Earth space is a tiny, tiny point inside that universe. And so our universe is vast. And yet compared to our sister universe, and it is a more vast. So when we think that our point is just a tiny point, and when we reference something that's much bigger, tiny is not tiny enough. So what are we doing exactly? Well, first of all, Rick Crammond and the Universal Council have been for 383 weeks bringing the one planet, one nation, one race for justice and world peace to the forefront because that's a ticket. We have a Universal Council that is earthbound. There is a Universal Council that is universal bound. That's why it's called the Universal Council. And so, how do we bring these two facets together? Well, it's the same way that we have to bring our understanding of our existence together. The plasma rule is where the higher strength feeds the weaker strength. A lot of people think that the higher strength beats up the weaker strength, or the higher strength steals from the weaker strength. Well, so when these two strengths come together, it becomes a point of conflict. But in actuality, it's a binding zone. Now, that doesn't mean it's graceful. That doesn't mean there isn't friction. And it doesn't mean that, we always get along. But what it does mean, it's a manifestation of the inertia density. And that's what we're talking about today, is trying to make this inertia point and understand that energy binding is very important. There's a self-serving aspect of it because no one cares about you any more than you do. And that's a fact. And if you try and delegate your care, you will find that others will care for you from their point of view. And if they don't care for you, well, guess what? You're getting the short end of the stick. And a lot of people extend this to be self-serving at the expense of others as a result of that, forgetting, of course, that we were self-serving at the expense of the universe, which was giving unconditionally to begin with. So it does not have a balance sheet of income and expenses. It gives unconditionally. And so for us, we get the chance to use that energy and bind ourselves into our fields and understand what is it that these fields need to convey. And so someone somewhere has given us 10 commandments to help us along. And of course, then we find out that are another 14 commandments. And the one that has been bothering me particularly is thou shalt not lie. And that is because it's one of the fundamental rules in poker. A good poker player is a good liar. And sometimes you have to lie to get ahead. But it also becomes entertainment. And when that entertainment becomes life-threatening, then it's not entertainment either. So we are playing for keeps here because it's our life. It's our understanding. And most of us go through life without asking these questions. And it's most disconcerting when you ask those questions and you don't get the answer, or the answer that accommodates you is, of course, well, I don't know. And we don't know. Collectively, we as a humanity species, we don't know. So, but obviously someone does know because they gave us all these commandments, and we wonder why we were specifically given these commandments. And I was wondering if, dogs get the commandments, or cats, or, how about corn or tomatoes, or ants? There are 10 commandments of ants. We are seem to be the only ones that get this. So, maybe we're very privileged that someone has helped us along to understand how we should live. And obviously, one could say that it's been effective to a certain degree. One could say the opposite as well. So because of our current status, we are all really seeking vitality enhancement because this planet is very toxic. It's toxic mentally, toxic emotionally, toxic physically, and it is affecting our overall health and well-being. And so as we grow older, this becomes more apparent, and it becomes front and row center. As we were younger, we were pretty devil may care with respect to our physicality. And of course, we weren't fully understanding of our emotional stability. Uh, it was more emotional and less stable, of course. But as we grow older, we become wiser, and sometimes we become old too fast and wise too slow. So we need a pump up, and that's what the universal body enhancement units have been delivering. And it isn't a static answer. It is dynamic insofar as we are continually developing, and we are on the verge of breaking through with even more advanced technologies. And so, how far advanced do these advanced technologies have to go? Well, who says how far they have to go, and who says they don't have to go farther? So the point of the matter is that if you go through life and you don't know what your purpose is, that is a sad state of affairs. And that's one of the reasons a lot of people are so depressed. And then of course, that's one of the reasons a lot of people take advantage of that, because they don't know how to get on the transmutation highway. And so we've been led to believe for the last couple of years that the transmutation highway is the fastest highway. And and it is a very fast highway, way faster than what we've been operating on. And yet, there's more. But one of the things we do have to realize is that there is a difference between the various highways. So one of the things we see is that the transmutation highway is dependent on the carbon and the link up between the carbon 16 and the carbon 8, because that gives us carbon 24. And then, of course, we have the carbon 14 and the carbon 10 on the transition highway, and that also gives us carbon 24. But down on the transmission highway, the lowest energy state, the one that we dwell on most of the time, you could say as bottom feeders, we are only getting half the picture, the carbon 12. And when I say half the picture, it only became obvious when we introduced the cups of life, because it was 2 cups of life. So it was the monatomic science through the nanocoding process, and we are talking about the intermediate nanotech. However, we were looking at the inner space strength, which gave us an emotional strength, but also a physical strength. And the two worked together. So we had the 2 cups working together to give us a Gans with a radiance manifestation that was different in different circumstances. In other words, we were able to produce different ganses like carbon dioxide or calcium gans, zinc or copper gans, and even H2O or water GANs and amino acid GANs. And now we see, well, wouldn't this be great? We could produce gold GANs. But if we can do that, then we can produce all sorts of ganses. And then we can also make ganses of ganses. And we see that we can make different cups, not just emotional and physical, but we take into consideration the cup of the soul. And each one has a magnetical gravitational relationship and a soul at the core. And when you bring all three together and galvanize them into one, shall we say, field, then that has a magnetical gravitational relationship, and that too has a soul. So it's the collective soul of the three subsouls, if you will. And so if we understand that concept, then we can look at the cup of the universe and we see, well, there we go. We have two sides of our brain, a left side and a right side, just like we have one cup and a second cup. And so there is a relationship between the copper GANs, which is physical, and the zinc GANs, which is emotional. And then we have the carbogen, which is part of the environment. And so we bring all of these fields together. They are individual fields and they do interact. But when they come together, we don't segregate them. We bring them together, 1 plus 1 plus 1. And then we end up with our physicality, which is 3. But the thing is, we still have the 1 plus the 1 plus the 1. So we literally have more than 3. And we've been able to manufacture that. And we call that our brain. And it's giving us a gravitational representation, which we call our body. And likewise, the Earth has its own grand central station, and it can produce many different ganses. So the thing is that the Earth manifests these ganses into different elements, and yet here we are looking at these ganses that we've been able to produce. So each of those are different and over and above the basic 3 ganses that we were concerned with, which is our emotional, physical, and soul cups. So there's more. Always there's more. And so where exactly are these limitations? So now we are beyond the Beijing conference level, where we see the older technology that we've been learning for about a decade, and we see the rotating fields and how we can produce gold. Well, this is not a GANs. This is the real deal, the real gold, the thing that everybody is craving for and using as a foundation for our financial system, which is overriding our well-being. And so this is what happens to us when we look at what we call angular density. When we're going to the density of gold, we all become like fallen angels. We call it falling angels because we're increasing the density. And when you do that, you increase the pressure. And so that is all representative of our increased gravity. And so we define angular density by the angular momentum, which equals the moment of inertia times the angular velocity. And so that's a handy equation to understand. So there's a relationship in the falling. And when we look at the plasma science and understand the basic difference between the old science and the plasma science, we have to think outside the box. And so where for many of us, being a millionaire would be wonderful. It's 6 figures. It's in the mega category. But we now have a lot of billionaires. And as you know, they say, why marry a millionaire when you can marry a billionaire? And it's 3 orders of magnitude wealthier. You still might end up in divorce, however, but at least you have 3 orders of magnitude of satisfaction on the divorce settlement. But when we go in the other direction with the micro, and then we go into the nano, well, all of a sudden we're into this plasma science, which is giving us a whole different perspective. And we can even go further than that. But the thing about the plasma science, each of these levels, it's like a stepping stone. And so you can kind of like walk up and walk down the steps. We're not sure which direction you're going. That's hasn't been discussed. But each of these steps is actually a field. And so you can see the relationship of these fields. And if so, this is not to scale, obviously, but the tera being big and the pico being small. So when we discuss the plasma relationship, we can say the bigger one is gravitational because it's more dense, and the smaller one is magnetical because it's less dense. And so we understand that the air is above the ground, and so the air is less dense and it's magnetical, and the ground is more dense, so it's gravitational. And we understand that, and we're grateful we understand that because that's why we're walking on the ground and not on the ceiling. But what we have to understand is that there are boundaries between each of these fields. And so they kind of create a fence that contains that field. And in order to do that, it really is more of a rotating field. And so we can stay within the, shall we say, the tera range and not leave it. Or we can jump to the giga range, or we can jump from the giga to the mega, or we can just go from the tera right to the nano. So, that would be the express elevator. And so when we look at the relationship, it still looks kind of linear, but as you can see, the lines aren't parallel. But in either case, we're looking at the extremes. We don't live in those extremes. When we look at, for instance, temperature, the room temperature is our comfort zone. So when we go way below room temperature, like into freezing, well, that would be very cold. Or if we go very hot, then that would be unbearable. And so our comfort zone is somewhere in the midpoint. Well, with the plasma science, we're going outside of our comfort zone, and a lot of people don't like that, which is kind of too bad. But for us, when we've discussed how to put a charge on a copper wire, we nanocoated it. And so we found that the nanocoating is actually a carbon. And so many of us understand that the nanocoating is monatomic. In other words, each particle is separate, and yet it is bound somehow to the wire. So that structure is totally different from the wire itself. And we found out that it's actually a carbon nanocrystal. And so if we look at the copper wire, which is copper, and we look at the nanocoating, which is carbon, and say, well, how do we get the carbon from the copper wire? Where did the carbon come from? Now, interestingly enough, we could do the same thing with zinc, and we can nanocoat zinc, and we would still get carbon. So in fact, every single product that we have in the elemental tables can have a nanocoating, and that nanocoating would be carbon. But if you have a solid wire, well, you can create a nanocrystal. But what happens if you have a liquid? Well, so this becomes a different a way to approach it. Then if you have a gas, there's a different way to approach it. Well, what happens when we go beyond gas? Well, there's a different way to approach that as well. So the important point is the connection. So we know that the North Pole connects to the South Pole. And so each nanoparticle, which is like a diamond crystal, has a connection on the North Pole connected to a neighbor's South Pole. However, it's undifferentiated because you can connect to the neighbor on the right or you can connect to the neighbor on the left. And there's no particular way to decide. It's just that a North Pole connects to the South Pole. And so there is a connection there. It's not visible, but because these are nanoparticles and in a monatomic state, so they are connected the same way as the atomic particles inside the substrate, which in this case would be a copper wire. So that connection is what we're referencing here, the connection and the connection. And so there are two connections, and they're both possible. And in fact, they're both possible at the same time, because if you're going somewhere, you have to know where you're going. But when you get there, you have to know where you came from. If you don't know those two connections and you don't make that reference, what are the chances that you'll have a successful trip? So it doesn't help if you have what we call random charges. And so what that means that each of these nanoparticles could be twisted in a certain way. Each nanoparticle has a north and south pole, but they're not all facing in the same direction. So what do we do to change that? In the basic nanocoding process, we take a meter and we have two electrodes on that meter, and we touch the two extremes, one in one corner, one in the other corner, and we put a charge through the substrate, be it a plate or be it a coil or just be it a straight wire. And we understand that because when we align things, and if you look at, say a boat or a boat in a regatta, if you want to perform better, it's nice to have all the oars going in the same direction at the same time. So sometimes the oars are behind you and sometimes the oars are in front of you. But it certainly helps when your teammate is rowing in the same direction at the same time and together. So you end up going much faster. So I think we understand that alignment is very, very important in increasing the capabilities. So we do that with the charge alignment to increase the potency of the nanocoding process. Since the nanocoding process is in a physical state, it would be very good if we could do the alignment before we do the nanocoding. So before the nanocoding settles down. So even while we're in the caustic state, to actually do the charge alignment. So that becomes easier. And then what we find is literally the crystals kind of all lean over in the same direction. And when we say the same direction, we don't really decide that direction. The nanocrystals themselves decide that direction. What we do is we set the endpoints. So the crystals themselves become points within those endpoints. In other words, the crystal alignment within the nano alignment is an inertia point, because that alignment is in between the two endpoints. So this becomes the beginning of our understanding of an inertia field. And so literally all of these crystals lay down and come together. And then you have the multiple layers, and then you have the alignment with all the layers as well. So within a layer, you have alignment. Between the layers, you have alignment. Layer to layer, you have an alignment. And so that alignment now will be a North Pole or a South Pole, so that when the energy comes in, it'll come in at the South Pole and exit out at the North Pole. And so that is your monatomic alignment. And then, of course, the crystals themselves are no longer round, but they nest. And in that nesting process, they become more potent. And then they create a nanofield alignment. So this field is around the nano diamond structure. So it is now external, and it is still part of the nano alignment. And it is all around the wire. So in this case, we're talking about a copper wire. It's nano-coated all around. So this field alignment goes all the way around, and it acts as one field. But it is very potent by orders of magnitude, and with the alignment, it's even more potent. By adding more layers, it's even more potent. So every action increases the capability of the nano coating. And that's just in this particular nano alignment that we're looking at. So if we look at a battery, and batteries are an integral part of our lives today, you can hold a battery in your hand and you hope that there's energy inside the battery. So you're holding the battery, the battery is holding the energy. So it seems like you're holding the energy, but you cannot hold energy in your hand. You have to put the energy in a battery before you can do that. Well, that's the same with water. You can hold a cup in your hand, and that cup could be full of water, but you can't hold water in your hand because the water will just flow because it doesn't have a containment. You can cup your hands, but you're still going to spill water all over the place. You need a vessel, or you need a containment of some sort to be able to maintain this. And then if you want to have water that flows from one vessel to another, then you would have to have some kind of input, and then you would have to have some kind of output. And so what we're going to talk about now is the daisy chain connection path. And so when I look at the daisy chain, you find that these vessels of water are all on the same level. And so what do we see here? Where we see the water is coming in one vessel, and then it has a connection to the next vessel. That connection could be a tube, or it could be some kind of capillary connection. It could be a wick. So as long as there's some way to connect, the point of this is all the vessels are on the same level in terms of density. So the water coming in is anaerobic. It's magnetical. And we say it's anaerobic because the water going out is aerobic. And that's one of the whole purposes of creating this daisy chain, is that people say, oh, water is just water. Well, water has different pH, and water has a different, shall we say, oxygen content. Well, how is that possible when, it's H2O? So that it should be the same. But we find that some water is fairly stagnant and therefore not able to support life, the kind of life that we might want, which would require more oxygen. So by putting it through a reaction like this, it becomes aerobic. And so what is the, shall we say, fallout from this? Each exchange from vessel to vessel is an inertia point. Excuse me. So we have a progression. If you've ever set up a daisy chain, you know that in order to get this thing going, you have to add more and more water before you see the result going out. So the daisy chain becomes additive. And so the water goes in the first vessel, flows to the second vessel. Now you have water coming in still from the beginning, but you also have water coming in from the first vessel. So now you have more energy. And so it becomes additive. And the third, and the fourth, and the fifth, and the sixth. So you still have a direction of flow, you still have a charge, but each charge is now getting stronger. And so you have an alignment. And so with the additional strength, that magnetical anaerobic state becomes a gravitational aerobic state. And so this would be a fundamental learning tool for someone who's in the aquarium hobby or has a pond to understand how to improve the oxygenation of their pond simply by creating additive daisy chains. But interesting thing happens is that once you get the exit of the water out of the last daisy chain, the connection is equal. The inertia point is equal right across. So something really funny happens. You get this inertia point daisy chain, and each one is equal because the water coming in is pulling. I'm sorry, the water coming in is pushing, the water going out is pulling. If you stop the pushing, you will stop the pulling. So as long as there's pushing, there's pulling. So as long as water is coming in, water will go out. And so this will continue. And if for some reason the daisy chain gets broken, or if for some reason the pushing stops, the water will just level out and will wait for the inertia point to start again. And so then you go through the additive process, you create the connection between the magnetic and gravitational fields, and then you have the balance where you have two forces, one coming in and one going out. And the one coming in is dependent on the one going out because it's reflected in the inertia point of the daisy chain. And so what am I trying to say by this thing? Is that each pH has this stairway anomaly where we have this change from this hydrogen to this hydroxyl. And each one is an order of magnitude. And so we have this pushing and pulling between the magnetical and gravitational relationship. But the thing is, this stays within the context of, shall we say, in this case, a 1 pH, and that pH here is between 4 and 5. Well, the same thing happens between 5 and 6. But what causes us to cross that threshold? That is not even discussed because we're only looking at half the picture. What causes the pushing and the pulling? So what we have here is an inertia point that is showing that there is a reaction to the energy coming in and the energy going out, which we don't see. But what we do see is the containment. And so that containment becomes the field alignment, which we would call the gravitational inertia point. So the force field is going around the copper wire along the nano alignment, whereas the gravitational inertia point is going through the core. So now we have a containment between the magnetical and gravitational point, and it goes all around. This is all part of the nano alignment. So now what we have is an inertia point created from the interaction of the magnetical gravitational field on one side and the gravitational magnetical field on the other side. And since it's all the way around, this pairing repeats itself and it becomes aligned. So not only are the nanoparticles aligned because you've done the alignment, but also now the rotating field that goes around is also aligned uniformly right around. So now you have increased the potency again, but we still don't know where we're going. So to demonstrate this inertia point, if we look at what is called a shooter, which is a cocktail served in bars, it's a shooter, or it's called a shooter or a shot, is a small serving of spirits. And it's kind of a mixed drink, usually about 1 US fluid ounce or 30 milliliters. And why they call it a shooter is because you typically gulp it down. But what is interesting is that a good bartender will know the sequence because each spirit is of a different density. And this is the secret of the, shall we say, the spirit industry, because they understand density and they understand how to manipulate it. But it's kind of interesting to look at this picture and you see that here you have 3 different spirits and they indeed do have different densities. And of course, the most dense one is on the bottom, that's gravitational. The least dense is on the top, that one's magnetical. And then you have the center point, which is somewhere in between the two. And that becomes your transitional density. The overall picture, the relationship between the magnetical and gravitational containment and all of the things that are in between becomes that inertia point. So the inertia point is not only the transitional point in between, but it includes the magnetical and the gravitational. So in other words, without these other relationships, this is not a shooter cocktail. This is just 3 different kinds of alcohol. And that's what we do in dimension building. You look at a point and it's undifferentiated. You add a second and connect it. It's still undifferentiated. So you don't know what it is. It's just 2 random points, but they're connected. And then you add a third and you connect 2 more. So now you have 3 undifferentiated points. If you add 1 more and you connect it 3 times, you now have 4 undifferentiated connection points. This is a star formation. And so we understand that a star formation has a magnetical gravitational relationship, and that's just, it's undifferentiated. We know the gravitational is the combination additive of 3 points, and the magnetical is the singular 1 point. And so that becomes your difference, but of what? We don't know of what. All we know is that the difference between the atomic state and the monatomic state is that in the atomic state, it's a lower density. And so you have this chain of atoms in the atomic state. They are literally linked together physically. But when you get into the monatomic state, which is the nanocoating, they're not chained. And that's very representative of how we operate because we can move, we can breathe, we can eat, and we can play sports and play music and do whatever because we're flexible. And this monatomic structure allows us to do that. And then, of course, that requires a lot of energy. And so by going into the monoatomic state, which is of a higher order of magnitude, we have more energy inherently. And so that means that we become the inertia product field of the benefit of the interaction of the magnetical gravitational field forces and everything that is in between. So we're looking at a three-dimensional recombination of the forces. So each one has its own choice, each one has its own path, and each one is determined. And that determination then affects the neighbor's determination. So if we look at, let's say, on the x-axis, it has its own path, and even if we flip it around, it's still going to have its own path. And the z-axis is going to have its own path, and so is the y-axis. So it doesn't matter how you flip things around, but when you recombine everything, as if it were a shooter, you would have this three-dimensional recombination. And so it appears to you as one cohesive unit. But the truth of the matter is, it is a cohesive unit that is an inertia point manifest from these three different dimensions. And you can manipulate these dimensions because they will maintain their integrity by regardless of how you port them. And the way that we understand fundamental porting is to have a crystalline portability through different energy state transitions from solid to liquid or from liquid to gaseous. Now we have gaseous to plasma. And so they will maintain their integrity, although the crystalline structure is kind of hard to see. We can see it in a solid form. We can see it in the liquid form, provided we put it in a cup or a glass. And, we can see it in a gaseous form, provided we put it in a gas cylinder or a bag, a balloon. But the plasma state, that doesn't see the physical limitation. That transcends the physical limit, goes outside of the diamond structure. It becomes a field representation. And that field representation will contain the crystalline connectivity and the crystalline stability and maintain its capability of portability from energy state to energy state. However, you won't see the individual energy states because it's undifferentiated. So when we look at these MAGRAV mileposts, we see that a MAGRAV is really a relationship between the magnetical and gravitational forces. And there are different ranges. And then within those ranges, there are different gradients. So fundamentally, we can see that there's a similarity in our point of view. When we look at the body has a higher energy, which is emotional, very magnetical, and physical, very gravitational. The atom, well, we know the electron is magnetic and the proton is gravitational. Water, of course, there you've got the hydrogen and the oxygen. Hydrogen has a mass of 1, oxygen has a mass of 8, and it's 8 times more dense than hydrogen. So we know that the acidic is negative and the alkaline is positive. So this chart kind of gives you a basic relationship between the magnetical and gravitational relationships as it would pertain to kind of practical things that we see around in our life. But the truth of the matter is that we have other references. So one of that is that the magnetical is the giver, and it has a field. And the other is the gravitational taker. And yet in the plasma science, we say that the higher strength feeds the weaker strength. So we hit kind of an anomaly here where if the gravitational is a taker, well, it has to take, it has to bind its energy. So that means it continues to take, whether it be from a higher to a lower, or whether it be through a daisy chain or some kind of connection or nano coating, it actually becomes the gravitational taker. And the magnetical giver is the energy that the gravitational is giving through the magnetical charge. And then it goes to another point. So we've seen it basically it goes out to the North Pole and connects to the South Pole. So the North Pole is the giver, the South Pole is the taker, but it doesn't tell you which direction that you're going. So we have a connection between the negative and the positive, and we have a connection between one field and another, and that's all we have. It's all undifferentiated. So, but what we do understand is that that field is an inertia point. So there we have, now we have a point, and that point, according to book number 1, is the combination of the matter state, dark matter, and antimatter coming together as a universal order of creation of matter. But it's hooked up to another point, which is made the same way. And, which way is this going? Well, we just have a connection, but what does that mean? There has to be an energy that flows down that connection. And so that path is the structure of the light. And it's still undifferentiated, isn't it? Because you don't know which way it's going. So when we look at the carbon inertia highways, they are clearly differentiated because we have a relationship between the higher energy, which is the carbon-16, and the lower energy, which is the carbon-8. Even if we step down into the transition state, the carbon-14 and the carbon-10 has a gradient. So the problem is on the transmission level at the lowest. What do we relate that to? So obviously we're missing something. So there's a duality, which we're talking about, where we go from one point to another point. And isn't that important if you're doing a frequency relationship? If you turn on the radio and you want to listen to the music, there has to be a station transmitting that music. And then your radio ends up being the receiver. So that transmission becomes the connection between 2 points. Oh, there we are. We have now 2 points, and you as the listener are enjoying that music, and you are the inertia point, you see, because you're the one who is drawing that energy. So our positioning then means that we have to have a relationship between one connection and another connection. So in other words, the transmission has to be the radio station transmitting the signal, and the receiver is the radio receiving the signal. So the connection is in between those two and those 2 points, and that connection becomes the inertia point. And that's how we get the benefit of that. So if that is the case, then we understand that our physicality is only part of the picture. So within that picture, we're able to traverse the various inertia highways. However, that picture has two sides. There's the one side that we can see, there's the other side that we can't see. So that gives us a complete picture. It's still undifferentiated, but now we understand that in terms of our point of view, that physicality can change. But so can the source. So there's a range on both sides. On the one side that we can see, we've covered all these variations. And then on the other side, there are all these variations which we can't even see, but those are variations that affect what we do see. And so we have to take that into account. Well, how can we take that into account when we can't even see it? So we have to understand that there is a gradient change. It goes from the gravitational to the magnetical because the higher energy feeds the weaker energy. And so this is how we can do our positioning. But the problem is that as we become more dense, we actually become smaller. As we get closer to the core, we are still gravitational. In fact, we are adding to that gravitational strength, but we become smaller and smaller and smaller. So although Jupiter is a mighty big planet, it is very gaseous, so it's not very dense. Earth is a smaller planet, but it is much more dense. So what does that mean? It means in the relationship to the sun and the distance from the sun, the Earth is closer to the sun than Jupiter, which means that Jupiter is magnetical and Earth is gravitational. Oh my God. So the bigger is not stronger. And that is the point. In terms of our understanding of what it means to be the gravitational, we have to understand that size is not the only factor. And we have to understand that density is not the only factor. And the reason for that is because energy can flow in many ways. It doesn't just flow along one path. And it doesn't flow along one dimension. And it doesn't flow along two dimensions. So when we do the dimension building and we take 2 points and then we have another pair of points and we overlap those points may be undifferentiated, but if we're building a dimension, there has to be some kind of change. We have to make it differentiated to achieve a connection. So the relationship between one pair of points has to be magnetical gravitational. And then it can overlap a second point, and it too, within that overlapping field, has to have a magnetical gravitational relationship. So the first pair is differentiated. The connection to the second pair is differentiated, but the relationship on the second pair is still undifferentiated. And so we come to a point that if we're going to build the third dimension, then we have a dilemma here, because how do we put them all together? Sure, they're overlapping, but they're not connected, are they? And this is all gravitational. So wait a second. So this is causing a problem. So clearly the inertia points, in order to be differentiated, they have to have a containment of a magnetical gravitational relationship. And so each point then has that representation. So going back to a pair of points, there has to be a relationship, magnetical gravitational, to facilitate the connection. And then the next pair has to achieve the same. And the third pair has to achieve the same. And so the collective, each inertia point, then becomes differentiated. And the three inertia points come together and create this gravitational base. But coming together, all three create an containment field that now takes into account all three inertia points. So the structure of your gravitational inertia point containment becomes manifest in its gravitational physicality. And so we can now produce physical inertia products, like gold. But we are forgetting the other half of the equation again. So the other part of the star formation, of course, is the magnetical peak. So the base is gravitational. We know that because it's more dense. And so the peak is less dense. And so that is magnetic. And so we see that same structure in how we created in Beijing. We had these rotating balls, and they created this plasma field around. And we created a star formation. And interestingly enough, they were all on the same level, just like our daisy chain. So it was like a flat star, wasn't it? So there you have three inertia points and a center inertia point, and the three on the outside were forming your gravitational base, and the one on the inside forming your magnetical inertia point. Didn't we say with the nano coating that the core was gravitational and that the field that went around was magnetical? There's something wrong here. What are we missing? So we're missing a context to the environment. If you want to create an additive daisy chain, you have to have a flow coming in, and then that will give you a flow going out. So in the case of these reactors, the energy coming in was the cosmic rays, and the energy coming out was an inertia manifestation of gold. And as long as the energy was coming in, the manifestation of gold going out was continuing. and it was additive. The longer they worked, the more productive they became. And that is the essence of the dynamic plasma. It then extends beyond its containment field. It extends beyond its physicality. It's that external field, like for us as human beings, we have an aura that extends beyond our physicality. And so this is fundamental for us in terms of growing and in terms of healing. We grow into our aura and we heal into our aura. We only see the growth as we measure ourselves or as we heal ourselves, repairing the tissue. But if we understand that the aura is the higher strength and it's feeding, is that enough? So there is more to take into account. And so we see that when we're looking at the magnetical gravitational field forces, we see that the physical matter state and the GAN state, which are also physical, and the rotating balls, which obviously are physical, and the motors that drive them are obviously physical, they're all part of the gravitational effect because they're all more dense. When we were talking about the plasma and the dynamic plasma state, they're less dense. And so they're magnetical. And so that is the energy that is flowing. The magnetical energy is what's flowing and giving, and the gravitational energy is taking. And that's what we're seeing in the manifestation of our physicality. But that's just a taking. How do we manifest the taking without manifesting the giving? Impossible. It's impossible because the star core component has a magnetical gravitational relationship, but it doesn't stand in isolation. It has to have a relationship with another, like in the nanocoding process. The monatomic are all stars. They're diamond stars. And yet, which way are they aligned? And so what we find is that the magnetical are giving to each other. And that giving point is the gravitational inertia point. So both sides are giving, and they're giving in different field strengths. So although they are still stars, the link up between them is an inertia point. And in order for that to maintain its gravitational stability, it has to have a magnetical relationship. So all points are not the same. And this is very important when we do our star matrix bonding because you don't just link one to the other. That's in one direction, one dimension. You have one pair. And so if the two are coming together negative to negative, in order to facilitate the attraction, there has to be a gravitational field that is connecting, and maybe you can't see that. But if it's positive to positive, well, there has to be a magnetical field that's attracting. And then if you want to go across, then the gravitational has to be connected to the magnetical, and the magnetical has to be connected to the gravitational, but it's still undifferentiated. And that's not the point here. The point is that you have two inertia points, which are gravitational, and those inertia points are bonded together with a magnetical field. They have to be. Otherwise, there would be no inertia bonding. And as you can see, the adjoining fields from the upper and the lower star formation, the points are negative because they're the points of the star. And the base, their bases are positive. But there's a crossover in order to link one to the other. Because if there wasn't, then you would have repulsion that way. So in order to maintain an attraction vertically, you have to have a magnetical gravitational relationship. To have an attraction horizontally, you have to have a gravitational magnetical relationship. And in order to bring all of these together, doesn't matter which way you go, there has to be a magnetical gravitational relationship to facilitate the three dimensions of the bonding. So you have your covalent bonding, which we don't understand the magnetical gravitational, but then you have your trivalent bonding, your three dimensions. But once you get into your stars, you have your tetravalent. And so this energy that is portable will either go through a simple structure, which is undifferentiated. That's how you create the structure in the first place, or it'll go into a differentiated structure, which is involving complexity. The complexity is certainly more stable. And when it's stable, that leads to its portability. So in other words, that gradient of stability is a charge. And it's a charge that flows on a two-way street. But it flows through a switchboard connection. We haven't decided what that is, haven't discussed what that is. We're just saying that there's a transition matter which is relatively negative. There's another transmission matter which is relatively positive. It involves an inertia field of the X, Y, and Z axis. And then these two fields create this transfer state NP junction, which is a negative positive junction. And that too is an inertia state. So every time when you're looking at the conservation of energy, you find that there has to be an equality, but that equality is measured differently in different states. But the fundamental principle is still there. It's always a magnetical gravitational relationship. So each component is an inertial product field of that relationship. And we can see that it can transcend different states. So we can go from one side of the equation to the other side of the equation in a particular state, but we can also go from state to state, or we could just transcend on one side in one state and on the other side in another state. It all depends on how you connect them. And so we see this business with this nanostate, which is kind of within its own nano capsule. And we say, okay, so now we have an inertia product there, but where are we going? And that's the susceptibility, isn't it? So that susceptibility is variable based on strength. So there's an initial potential energy and there's a final potential energy. There's a gravitational and magnetical relationship. Then two, there's a balance. And that balance goes from a stable to an unstable, goes from acidic to alkaline. It becomes more stable when it's more complex, much more unstable when it's simple. That's the relationship between the magnetical gravitational balance reference. So where we are is in our ability to do the energy portability, where we have the energy state transition. And in one direction, it's an elevation where we take the state to the energy state. But in the other direction, it's an inertia where we take the energy state to the physical matter state. And so we could say that that's a pushing and a pulling through the daisy chain reaction. And as we look at the z-axis, which is an inertia point manifestation as a stairway to density, at each point, whether it's a pH of 5 or a pH of 6 or a pH of 7, for instance, becomes an inertia point manifestation. So we haven't discussed how we can cross that threshold, and we haven't discussed which way we're going to go. But what we do know is that if we add acidic to acid, it becomes more acidic. And if we add an alkaline to an alkaline, then it becomes more alkaline. Can we add alkaline to an alkaline without balancing the equation? So there are different potentiation layers, and there's different density transitions. And with causticity, we can facilitate unstable energy transition states. Now the question is, how do we predict? So when we look at these inertia products, we can say it has pH transition, but it's better to say that it has energy portability within a range to a range, or a state to a state. And it all comes down to facilitating the energy transition state. And the fundamental component is hydrogen. And it's like water, it's not just hydrogen, but we have orthohydrogen, we have parahydrogen. And what does that mean? Well, we have changed the direction of the charge. So we still have a polar charge, but depending on the relationship, there's a balance north to north, south to south. But then if we flip the poles, the north to north becomes an attraction, as opposed to north to north becomes a repulsion. Now we've created something different. And that is where the hydrogen interacts differently. So there's a source hydrogen, there's a field connection, we call it carbon-14. There's a universal coordination called carbon-60, and there's more. Too much for our plate at this point in time. But if we understand the basic rules, then we can extrapolate to understand that it's possible. And we know that it's possible because nature gives us many, many examples on how things are possible that we can't do. And when we look at the Earth space range details, we find that there are many, many elements, and each of them has their own containment. In other words, you could have a copper mine, you could have a gold mine, you could have a silicon mine, you could have an iron mine, a lithium mine. There's no bag, there's no cylinder, but there are neighbors. And those neighbors create a gradient. And within that gradient is a containment. And if the conditions are right, then that containment will manifest in the physicality a certain element, and only that element. So the positioning of that element has more to do with its neighbors than anything else. Because the relationship of the neighbors allows the inertia product point to be created. And once you have that point, which becomes the seed, then it can grow. And as long as those conditions remain that created the seed, then it can grow from there. And the reason that seed will grow is because it will grow into those conditions. So when we look at the pH stairway of both poles, we can elevate through causticity, or we can do the inertia through the maggrav positioning of our neighbors. And we have all these potentiation plasma layers in between. So those factors have not been specified. But what is specified is that everything on the book number 1, the universal order of creation of matter, is part of the nuclear feeding inertia. And so each one is a fragment of the complexity, and each one is looking and seeking gravitational stability. And each one is a representation of the dimensional portability of bringing together one field and another field and another field, and coming together with the combination of more than 3 fields, because you have to have the energy coming and you have to have the energy going. You have to have the energy pushing and you have to have the energy pulling. So there is a connection. And so that connection has to go through the inertia point. And so we have our pathways, and they're fed through the gravitational intensity of attraction, or the magnetical outensity of repulsion. So we can see that the electron is magnetical and the neutron is gravitational, but you can clearly see the difference, except it all depends on which way you're looking. Are you looking at the feeding side, or are you looking at the feedback side? Or do we understand that the two are working together simultaneously? So that when you look in the beginning and you say, well, the neutron came before the atom in the PM tick. Well, the neutron itself was a gravitational magnetical representation, which we call an inertia point. And from there, it split into an electron proton. So the electron and proton is also an inertia manifestation point, and the proton is an inertia manifestation point. And then there's another product that was created, was the PM tick, which is also another inertia manifestation point. And so whether you were coming or going, you say, well, if you want there to be light, then you know that that comes from the darkness. But if you need the light, then you are in the darkness. So where did that light come from to give you the light? So that light has to have a containment. Well, guess what? So does the darkness. The darkness has to have a containment. But there's a relationship. So the two are feeding each other. And that's the way the universe works. It's unconditional and is giving. This is all part of how the principal matter, the PM ticks, which are magnetical energy packs coming together through the convergence of the antimatter, dark matter, and mattergen, and creates this gravitational maggrav. And in order to understand its position, it is somewhere on this planet. And in that case, it has another inertia field reaction. Everything that is between these two fields becomes an inertia product and an inertia point. That inertia point becomes the seed, the germination seed from which it grows. And so depending on the positioning within that field interaction dictates whether it stops or it starts, or it continues. And so each inertia point is a manifestation of two plasma fields. But each of these plasma fields are universal travelers, and they're picking up different energies. And so in this representation, we can see that there are a lot of common energies, but they are not all the same. Each one is unique because it comes through a different path. It could come through one dimension or another dimension, or it could just take a more circuitous route, or it could take a more direct route. It could be near, it could be far. All sorts of attributes can come in together. So we need to be skillful in our understanding of this, because they all come together with a magnetical gravitational relationship, which we call the plasma science. So the matter plasma dimensions involve non-tangible and tangible feeding and feedback. And we are feedback dominant because our physicality is the feedback. So everything we relate from that point of view. We have to understand that that is an inertia product from these other fields, and that our existence is literally an inertia point, and from which we grew. And through that growing, we continue through what we call a learning process, which is why the educational part is so important, because life is for learning. And we see that because with the hydrogen, it is gravitational. But with the oxygen, it too is gravitational. But the hydrogen is magnetical and the oxygen is gravitational, and the coming together of the two create the water, which is a universal solvent that facilitates life on this planet. And if we go one step further, we can facilitate anything we want through the peace dome reactor, because that gives us a shielding. And in that reactor, we don't produce gold. In fact, the energy that comes together to produce that dense material is shielded. So the peace dome reactor will shield what we don't want and allow the penetration of what we do want. And we get to choose because we are more advanced. And how did we become more advanced? Well, we started with a inertia point, a seed, and grew. And so we create this humanity inertia shielding that shields us from hostiles and from aggression and from environmental harm and from fear mongering, because all of these things affect us. And so we don't always have to take it. We can shield ourselves. And this is the promise that the plasma science gives us as we go into uncharted territory. So you ask yourself, am I here or am I here? Well, we are in the beyond the nano monatomic state. And that includes our ancestral intelligence. We are the technology and we are the inertial product of that. And so we carry that forward. And in our life, we add to it. And the one thing that we know is that it's unconditional. It's fed through our soul. And if we could only tune in and plug into the Creator, turn on that power and drop out of our resistance and create this inertia point so that we can receive all of this energy. We have to understand that we have to provide the pattern. We have to understand how to make this pattern. And once we have the pattern, then we get the energy. So you kind of get what you deserve. And we need to get more. because this planet needs peace and prosperity. And after May the 10th of 2025, our research teams are burgeoning forward through various research teams. And we invite more knowledge seekers and more advanced scientists to join in and contribute to the peace and prosperity of this planet. We've been teaching for 595 weeks in a row through the Knowledge Seekers workshops to transcend the limitations of nuclear science, and it may appear to happen suddenly, but it all brings us to that greater oneness, to understand that we are all one humanity species, but we're also part of the Universal Council, and we're also part of the universe. So we need to have a technology release because our beds are burning. It's hard to sleep. We have a scientific rescue coming. A financial rescue is automatic. A political rescue, mandatory. A preservation rescue is the collateral when we do things right. So we have to trust to fly with the captain. And who is that captain? And we're training in that process. We have another session coming up in June. But the ultimate captain is your soul. That is of your ship. But we are just part of the fleet that is part of the universe. And so we see how the energy comes together in book number 1, and we see how the energy can break up with the book number 3. And we see the connection with book number 2. And in all cases, we see the whole picture, which means we're not part of any of these 3 dimensions. We could be in a 4th dimension, or maybe higher still. Our mission is to bring peace on earth and join humanity with the universal community, because we want to bring man as equal to all the beings in the universe by teaching the plasma science and technology equally to each and every one, so that no one is left out and no one is abused due to the lack of knowledge. So help us achieve this goal. This is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute, teaching the plasma science, welcoming all the beautiful knowledge seekers. We have a purpose. We have a mission to learn about the new selection process of the new plasma science. But we need a world peace treaty. We need to choose that first. We need to sign it and mean it with sincerity. The point of the true nanotech is to maintain integrity. And you can see that through the manifestation. And with the peace dome of outer space, we have to understand that it could be an umbrella to shield us, or it can be a fountain of whatever you want to facilitate peace and prosperity. So is the inertia of the present governed by dimensions of history? Why should it be? If there's one thing to understand, it is time to learn the history of self in a universal context, because the inertia of a peaceful self can migrate as a superconductor. The inertia point of our point of view is that point between our belief and our experience. Plasma science needs to continue to be delivered and is delivered daily via the Peace Dome in a practical exchange for peace on Earth. So welcome to the new golden outer space age. That's the end of the class. I hope you all enjoyed the session. Thank you for allowing me to continue to present.
And thank you, Alex. We've come a long way, baby. And I know that was some sort of commercial ad or something in the past, but we certainly have grown, and you've helped that process of enlightenment. We've increased our knowledge by orders of magnitude, I think, before the foundation and after we've been here for a while. But I think there's more to grow in, as you indicated. So let's see if the participants have any thoughts or questions they'd like to ask. maybe you need to get a smaller, I know you're spoon feeding us, Alex, but maybe we need a smaller spoon.
Well, let's understand this. You can't play poker in outer space. And since most of us are trained on this earth and we like to play the game of deception, we have to understand that since it's a two-way street, you have to understand that both sides know how to play poker. And so in that game, based on what I've said today, I want to reference the pushing and the pulling. And so that's really what it is. You push what you want to push, but sometimes less pushing is better. And so I think that's where the subtlety comes in. We have to understand that there are different ways and means of achieving that result. And if the delay in consequences on this planet allows us to be belligerent and violate, shall we say, the commandments for the sake of our self-serving needs, that delay of consequences disappears when we enter the universal community. So you can't bluff your way into it. It requires substance. And the only way to achieve that substance is to manifest according to your wish. And if you wish death and destruction, you shall have it. And if you wish peace and prosperity, you shall have that as well. You just have to choose what you want to work for. So you cannot bomb your way to peace. That is a violation of the universal law.
And again, these teachings are about letting us know we're not powerless. We never thought we could affect the change on this planet except in the matter state, and that doesn't work so well. But now we're opening up this energy dimension, and thank you, Alex, for continuing to provide these, I would call it international teachings right now, because we have people from Europe and Africa and America and many different souls who are probably here from other places as well. So
Well, that's one of the advantages that we have with this particular class is because we have people from all the continents here represented, and they are eagerly absorbing as much information as they can so they can digest it and present it in their own way, because we all are sharing the same grief with trying to explain this technology to newcomers. They seem to always fall back to being devil's advocates. So I made that mistake once. I wanted to be a devil's advocate, and I got severely reprimanded because I said the devil doesn't need help. So if you want to understand the truth, that's what you have to focus on. And it's just confounding to me that, when I looked into the advanced science in the library, half the books were talking about potential new discoveries, and half the books were skeptics. And I thought, why would I spend time and effort to write a book, then publish the book, then distribute the book where all I do is downplay someone else's achievements? So the success of my book would rest on the downplaying of someone else's achievement, which means that without their achievement, my book is useless? Why would I spend so much time doing that? And then I realized it's because they are afraid of the change. And instead of agreeing with them, you look at the change and you ask, why are we afraid of this particular change? What is it that is so threatening? And you come to the answer and you say, wow, peace and prosperity is threatening us. Well, we haven't had that on this planet for a long time. We have had some success. You know, you can row your boat with one paddle. You paddle on one side and you paddle on the other side and you kind of zigzag your way down the river. But if you have a team and they're all rowing in the same direction, you go much faster. So why would you want to be a skeptic and saying, well, I don't think if you all row in the same direction that we're going to move faster and I'm going to show you because I'm going to go in the opposite direction. Yeah, they don't call that, going forward. They call that a braking system. It's where you step on the brake. And it's important to know when you step on the brakes or step on the accelerator. When you all row together, you accelerate. You only need one to slow you down. Back to you, Mark.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else would like to join the conversation? I spoke a little, Alex spoke a little, and anyone else want to come in? Now I'm thinking about emotions. I thought we were just creating emotions in a way, but apparently the interaction of the two fields creates an emotion. And is that emotion the inertia of the two fields?
Yes.
Okay. And if we go back to this idea of the neutron, I'm not fully settled on this about the neutron splitting into the proton and an electron. Does the neutron cease to exist at that point when it's given birth? Or let's say release an energy that splits and makes an electron and a proton. Does that neutron, if that neutron ceases to exist, and I know last week I think you said it does not, but others have said it does, and I thought I read somewhere where it does, but then if the neutron, once it gave birth to another neutron, electron, proton, we only have one neutron in the whole universe, wouldn't we, if that process, if the original neutron didn't stay? Because the proton and the electron that are created, once they split and they go out of business, you still only have one neutron. So I would say that the neutron that gives the birth still exists. And you still agree with that?
The energy pack that makes that neutron still exists. Your specific question is, does the neutron still exist? It all depends on if it is being depleted. So it would be like having a bag of, let's say, a bag of peanuts. You take one peanut out of the bag, you still have a bag of peanuts. But once you get to the last peanut, you're just left holding the bag. You don't have any more peanuts. So you can't call it a bag of peanuts anymore, can you? You wouldn't even call it a bag of used to have peanuts. It's just a bag. So now you completely change the personality of that bag. And it all depends on what you are doing. If you are depleting the field totally, then you would be every point that you deplete is 1 point on the path to total depletion. But if you're catalytic, then you act like the sun, where you can give unconditionally. It is because you give unconditionally that you constantly get fed. It's when you conditionally give, then you conditionally receive. And at that point, you start to limit things. And although the limitation sounds has a negative context to it, if that's what you wish to have a certain purity, then you want to limit that inertia point. So that inertia point becomes the seed of what you want, and everything that comes to that field is an inertia contributor, but only within those limitations. But we are clearly not limited to 1 point. We have kidneys and hearts and feet and noses and hair. So we are multiple points. And this is where it becomes a problem when you say, well, I am just going to have this one thing and it's going to solve everything. We don't have that skill set, but the universe does, because the universe supplies unconditionally. So you just basically spread the energy and you don't make the decision. You just give unconditionally, and whoever needs takes. But how can you do that in a field strength that is constantly taking and never giving? So that becomes taking at the expense, and it disables you. And when you are disabled, then you can no longer give. Well, this is the thing, though, that who is taking does not take that into account. They're taking everything else except taking that into account, because what they're doing is they have planted the seed of their own demise. Because if you keep taking from your neighbors and your neighbors can't provide anymore, then you lose your neighbors. And you say, well, I don't want my neighbors. Get rid of them. Well, yeah, but your neighbors are providing the sustenance that you need. And if they're gone, then you lost your sustenance. And this is the fallacy that we live on, because we say, oh, well, I'll just get more neighbors. And you're always drawing from the weakest, and you become a product of that weakness. That's where the fallacy sits. And so we get away from it, and for some people, well, I will only get a portion, like a factor, 5%, or like your credit card company, they get 2%. They have a small portion. It's just that they get lots of portions. So what we have to make sure that when we give that 2%, that we're keeping that 98% so that we can make more. And that's the trick. But if everyone were to contribute, we wouldn't have to work from a point of lacking. We could provide from a point of abundance. And that's what the plasma science does. It automatically, by definition, applies from abundance, because we have the universe. And this is the anomaly. The universe is gravitational. What? I thought the Earth was gravitational. Yeah. We are in that relationship between the gravitational side of the Earth and the gravitational side of the universe. We are the magnetical inertia point, and we are sitting in that bonding field. Back to you, sir.
Okay, and of course, the creation of the universe is one of the images you show. I don't know if you have that readily available, but it's very similar to the way the neutron splits, correct? And again, if the universe makes a smaller and a larger universe out of itself when it does it split, does the original universe cease to exist or it continues to exist? You know the picture you usually show? I guess it must be from book 3.
Yeah, I'm looking for it right now. I forget where it is.
Yeah, but it's the same process as I understand it.
Yes, but the thing is, where the neutron is and how it creates the atom is in the field context between the magnetical gravitational limit. So this is following the laws of conservation of energy. It doesn't disappear, it just changes its format.
But it had to absorb energies as the neutron does in order to release those. It can't hold it.
Exactly. So what you're looking at is a snapshot in part of an assembly line, if you will.
Right. Because this is the universe, the bigger circle here, correct?
Yes.
You're saying it splits off, or, the book is saying it splits off into a smaller one and an even smaller one. And my question is, does this original one cease to exist?
It all depends on the circumstance. Is it the last peanut in the bag, or do you still have a bunch of peanuts, or is someone in the back there keeps filling your bag? Oh,
The
well,
universe does, yes.
isn't that what the bartender does? Oh, you want another drink? Yeah, here, we'll fill you up. So, until you get drunk. So the catch here is the PM tick, you see, because the PM tick is the currency that facilitates this energy transaction. Okay, so you as a inertia point, you want to buy a car, which is an inertia point, right? It's a bringing together in a factory of the materials creates a car. So what is your currency? Your currency is money. So you give the money, you still exist. The person who sells the car takes the money, but the car still exists. So you and the car have not changed during that transaction. But in this case, the transaction is the PM tick, which is the energy, because the combination of the mass of the electron and the proton is missing, is not balanced to the mass of the neutron. It isn't. We round it off. We say, oh, it's close enough, it's 98% pure. It might as well be 100. Or, we get extreme, like in Canada, we don't have any pennies. So if it comes out to 3 cents, we round it up to a nickel. And if it's 2 cents, we round it down to a penny, right? Well, 2 cents is 40% of a nickel, and 3 cents is 60% of a nickel. So it isn't just a little fraction, it's a huge amount. And, this is, if you're going by percentages, 1 penny is 10% of a dime, but 1 penny is only 1% of $100 or a dollar. So everything is relative in that regard. So how much impact does this energy exchange take? It all depends on the circumstances. What we are looking at is the environment. Everything is contained within that universe. So we are only skillful in busting things up, or we create things to bust them up. Is that the purpose of life? Well, if that's the purpose of life, then, if the universe created the humanity species, then the purpose of that was to bust up the humanity species. Why would you do that? You might as well not do anything.
So again, back to this question, the neutron is releasing an amount of energy. That amount of energy is splitting, and some PM-TICs, and that amount of energy is splitting into a proton and an electron. But while that's happening, I don't know if the PM-TICs come out of the neutron or because the energy that was released starts interacting with its environment and creates some of these PM-TICs or fields. And some of these PM-TICs actually create a plasma right there. Some of them go back and interact with the neutron, as I understand it, and some of them wander off into the universe to look for someone to play with because they haven't found a match there. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does. The fallacy of that thinking, however, is that the PM tick that you say is coming back is not the same PM tick. Okay? If again, if you take a peanut out of that bag and you now have -1 peanut in that bag, someone adds a peanut. It can't possibly be the peanut that went out because you ate it.
No, it had an interaction. I agree.
Yeah, but the new peanut that comes in is a different peanut. And you still have a full bag of peanuts now. It's no longer a bag -1 peanut. It is now, say a full bag of peanuts. So you take one out and you put one in, it's still a full bag of peanuts. So that's the point. We are believing that each neutron is the same neutron, each atom is the same atom, and each PM tick is the same PM tick. It isn't. It is just a representation to show an exchange of energy. But if the neutron breaks up and creates an atom, that atom's no longer part of the neutron. It goes and now it has
Yes.
a relationship and is seeking density. And it goes somewhere else. Where is it going to go? Look, you have a factory full of workers. The factory is a neutron. These workers have to go home. They don't all go to the same home. So how do they decide? So in that home, they have an atomic structure. And the energy that they expend to go home is the PM tick. Well, where did that energy go? Well, we didn't decide that. We just spent that energy. So that energy will go wherever it wants to go, wherever it needs to go. So we seem to dictate where that energy goes, but we can't contain it. So we start to put regulations on, you don't want to drive a polluted car. So you drive a clean car. But to make that clean car, you create more pollution. So for some people, that's progress. But if you want to be truthful, then what you want is to be able to create your motion without the pollution, and then you have to identify what that pollution is. And so what we're talking about right now is the lowest of energy states, the physical state. And what we're trying to say here is that the contribution to that low energy state is contributed from a higher energy state. And at the same time, we're trying to say that we're not saying how high that energy state is. There's no rule that says it has to be the next step. It could be multiple steps. The point is that our reference at this point in time is the physical, practical application of this knowledge. And if we want to bring peace and prosperity to this planet, we have to do this from the opposite point of view, from the inertia creation fields. And then we will build what we want in our inertia product fields. And peace and prosperity is not just talk. It's something that needs to be delivered, and we're all part of the process. Back to you, Mark.
Right. So I'm thinking, let's just take an example. The neutron is the mother, and the mother gives birth to a child. We'll call that the electron and the proton.
Right.
But there's many other materials that come out of the womb in that process. And this is what
Right.
I'm calling the piemtics. There's fluids, there's other materials.
No, yeah, okay, but those aren't actually the PM ticks, but you're just using that as an analogy, right?
Yes, of course. Just from my what I'm recalling from what I think I understand, that's all. So it's just a point of clarification.
Yeah, well, in a factory, you know, they bring materials in and they produce a car, and whatever's left over, they call it garbage, right?
Scraps. Yep.
Yeah, well, you do the same thing in the kitchen, don't you?
Yep.
The packaging industry thrives on that notion. You go to the grocery store, you buy all these products, but you're buying packages as well. So you it's hard to get away from that, you know. How are you going to buy milk without a containment, or how are you going to buy a bag of peanuts without the bag? You know, well, we used to do that, right, at the market.
By handfuls.
Yeah. So, yeah, well, it's all a business plan. But the thing is, the overall thing about the business plan is that what is it contributing to the whole welfare of the planet? Or is it just contributing to the pocketbook? So if you look at, you know, what it is that you want, oh, you want that atom, so you don't need the PM tick. Well, you're missing one of the most important aspects of that. And that's what the problem is, you know, let's say with the household. You know, the household, you have a car, you have a job, you have a house, you know, you have a washer, you have a dryer, and you have stress. Okay, so why are you not having peace and harmony in your house? You have all the accoutrements of the physical manifestations that you've wanted. So peace and prosperity is an issue that comes from our comes from within. It comes from what we want, right? It comes from our inspiration.
Okay, anyone else want to thank you, Alex. Anyone else want to interject, make a comment? And again, he started with this twinity process quite a while ago. Remember, we had the twin cups. That was a number of years ago. We had the cup of man, which was another twinity process. So he's been sort of gradually bringing it up into this twinity system.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we see all the twinity products in the store as well. But that was sort of the first salvo into this idea of twinity when we started to make the cups, and then of course the cup of life and cup number 1 and 2, and another in a way match set.
Well, the difference between a cup of life, of course, was one's emotional, one's physical, whereas the twinity, they were supposedly identical. But it's impossible to have two identical cups.
Well, we connected the totality, I think, between the two in the
Yeah,
cup.
but one would have to, by definition, become magnetical, and the other one would have to be gravitational because they act as a twin in terms of our point of view. But if you want to be absolutely specific, you cannot have 2 points of energy at two adjacent points in the same time. It's impossible. So even if you have a plasma field, you cannot have two identical plasma fields. One will always have more than the other. So if you tune into that, and if you're not getting what you need, then you can alter it to, shall we say, reverse the polarity. This is where the skill set comes in. So you appreciate the inertia product that you get. So each of these, let's say in this picture, you have two plasma fields, but these plasma fields are inertia points. So in other words, if you want to modify this plasma field, you could modify it on this level, or you could modify it on the contributing energy fields. So you have a lot of flexibility. The other thing you can do is you can modify the other one and it would change the gradient, wouldn't it? So these are all flexible modifications that we can make, and you cannot just pinpoint and say, well, that is the de facto way to do it. So you have to take into account other things. So this is where you and your choosing comes into play. So yesterday it was raining. We haven't had rain for a while, so the farmers were extremely happy. And today it's very sunny, and the plants are really happy because they're able to take advantage of that rain and use it with the sunshine and grow. So it all depends on your point of view.
Right, and didn't we have the nano of the first cup connected to the wires or something of the second cup, and the nano in the second cup connected to the wires of the first cup?
Exactly.
Mhm. And that was called the twin cups. And then when we made a wire between them, this is where we connect the totality between the physicality and the emotional end. I guess again, I'm still trying to sort everything out, but we're getting
Yeah,
there.
but remember the twin cups, the energy was flowing in both directions. So the connection in between set up the pathway.
We'll probably understand it more as time goes on, or perhaps in future generations they'll see what we.
Well, Mark, I don't want to let this point go. That the inertia field is of the lowest energy field in that relationship. So when we're dealing in the matter state, the physical matter state, that being the lowest energy field, so that wire was the connector that set up the inertia pathway to create that inertia point. But that energy was coming from the environment, the plasma environment. So we set up the pattern, a magnetical gravitational relationship from one cup to the other, and a reverse magnetical gravitational from the other cup to the first one. That was the twinity. And then we created a connecting path. So the constitution of those cups was dictating the seed at that inertia point. If we were to change the nature of that inertia point, we would change the whole attraction of the gravitational force fields. The seed is fundamental as the attraction point. The inertia, the twinity set up the parameters, set up the environment. So within that environment, we set up the seed, and the energy that contributed to that seed and the growth of that seed came from the external environment. That's the part that we've always been missing. But the plasma science has gone beyond that, where the lowest energy state is in the plasma state. So if the plasma state is orders of magnitude higher than the physical state, you understand how far the Keshe Foundation has advanced, when the lowest energy state is of a high energy state, right? So that becomes the inertia point, but it's of a high energy state. So the relationship remains the same. That inertia point was created from two other fields, and those fields were created from two other fields. So if we go from that inertia state, we can split it up like the neutron into the atom, or we can bring it together and create the inertia point. So that was an excellent question you asked, and
I don't quite understand it, but so when we have two fields interacting to create an emotion, each field on its own, does that field have an emotion too, and you're actually creating a third emotion? Or
that's
are
correct.
they sort of neutral, and when they interact, they create that emotion?
No, they're not neutral. They are representative of the context of their conformity. They're not neutral. They have a distinctive quality.
Okay. Now, in these new systems, he seems to be, again, he said we're going for the upper part or the brain. Again, I know they trapped the soul with the headphones. It sounds like the soul is, in a way, trapped here, but also the brain, I think, is playing a more of a function than I think we give it credit for. A lot of times we hear people, oh, don't think that ruins everything. But again, how does this whole process start? He said the brain of the universe works exactly as the brain of the man. And these new plasmatic chips are working identically as the brain of the man as well. So there's something about this brain I think we're missing as well. That we just think it's, again, it's, we're not giving as much, I think, to the brain and its function and interaction with the soul as it's due, perhaps.
Well, the way I was introduced to this concept, and I was forced to be introduced to that because of a very serious health issue that I had. In my mind, I can envision myself being in a place. Let's say I'm in Canada. I can envision myself in a place where I was in the U.S. And I can envision myself there because I was there once. I have a memory of it, and if I give my attention to that right now, then I can see myself there. But I can do that instantaneously with my brain. I can't do that instantaneously physicality. I would have to get in a car, drive to the airport, then fly down to that place and get a taxi and go to that location. And you know that's a slow process. So it's clear that the brain is operating in a higher energy level than the body. So it only stands to reason that what's been missing from our humanity here is acceptance of this higher energy state as a part of our practical application, as a part of our practical living experience. We keep discounting it or pushing it off and depending on the physicality. So if I can only enjoy the plasma science in my imagination. Well, music is a prime example. As you know, how many times have you heard that music is nostalgic? And what is it that's nostalgic about it? If if that was a romance that you had many years ago, and that was, that was your song, that was the song you guys loved, and so it brought back memories of that. So that's you, but that song may not bring memories to someone else in the same way. But there are songs that would affect the whole audience and say, oh, that was a generation. And I'll tell you what that generation was when I was 16. Life was exciting. We were on the verge of exciting technological advancements, and it really didn't happen. I, I'm like totally disappointed. So, the uh, prospect wasn't fulfilled. And of course, that leads to depression. Well, we now have the prospects of fulfilling that. And it isn't just for us. That's the point. Because when our neighbors are peaceful and prosperous, then we can be peaceful and prosperous. So all we have to do is look after the health of our neighbors, and they'll look after our health. That's how it works. Thanks so much, everybody, for letting me continue to produce, and thanks, Mark.
Yep.
You're
Again, we've trusted the conventional science to tell us that we only use 10 or 15% of our brain, and I often wondered, well, gee, what is the rest of the brain doing all the time? If we're only using 10 or 15% of it, but now we're understanding we use 100% of it 100% of the time. So I think we haven't given credit in a way to the brain.
Well, you understand, if you don't use it, you lose it.
That's what they say. Okay, anyone else have a thought, a comment, a question?
Comment. Are you able to hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay, my internet has been bad. Alex, are you saying, I'm thinking of the Unicross. So we started off with the main ray, and then we started with the neutron, and that was incredible power, enough to create a Unicross, I guess. So the first neutron would be able to create all of the rest of the universes. Is that correct?
No, the magnetical gravitational field creates the environment to accept more energy. So if you look at the hydrogen, it is an electron proton. It's once we get into the other element of the periodic table of elements that they start to develop neutrons. So the gravitational effect increases.
Gail, we're getting a lot of feedback. We're not actually able to hear Alex.
So I just repeat that the hydrogen doesn't have a neutron. The other elements of the periodic table have. So, Gail, you're absolutely correct. That's what you have to start with. Once you start with that field, then if you want to add more to it, it becomes more and more dense. And then then you progress through the periodic table of elements. So you look at these first elements, hydrogen and helium, they're in a gaseous state. And you look at Jupiter and Saturn, they're in a gaseous state. So the thing is that as we become more and more dense, we start to add more and more of these elements. So now the question comes is, when does one neutron create another neutron? And I think what we're coming to realize is that it isn't more neutrons, it's a bigger neutron, so that this neutron can continue to split up a portion of it and create more atoms, and then be gravitationally strong enough to be able to attract more energy. And so then it becomes catalytic, and it all revolves around the initial seed. And that seed, to prosper, needs to be in an environment. So the earth has provided that environment, and each and every one of these elements grows from a seed in its own particular place, and it decides. It decides based on its neighbors. But the PM tick is an energy pack, and it is part of the energy that is traveling through the universe in every single direction through different paths. And so each energy pack, although it manifests into a hydrogen, has different components to it. And those components are embedded in the cosmic ray. And that cosmic ray has all of the elements. And then what we do is, by creating that particular environment, the same way the Earth does, we can choose, what do we extract from that cosmic ray? That is what the foundation has now perfected. And so we can produce gold from air. But it's not air. It's air that has a personality of all the elements. So we, in fact, create that environment that attracts and extracts the energy of the gold. And once it gets into that physical field, we put it through a reactor to manifest into its physicality. So we can manufacture everything that we want. So if you take the space technology, and then let's say we go to Mars, we can create whatever we want on the Mars. You don't take all the components with you, because then you have to carry it all. But when it becomes as part of the containment, and it becomes very, very dense, in other words, very, very tiny, like a PM tick, that PM tick has everything that it needs. So all we need to do is to expand that field and extract what we want. So that field can give us anything that we want. We just have to decide, and that's where the skill comes in. So we don't have to fight about anything. What we have to do is to learn how to do this skill and understand that that energy is bound within that containment field. So it's there. You just have to know how to extract it. Are you okay with that answer, Gail?
I'm swimming in it. It's beautiful. But I still have to figure out how I can do it. And also you said it's there, but let's say there's a different planet. Well, we talked about Mars, but it's in the same solar system. What if we're in another different solar system? So we would have a different package, and we'd have to learn how to extract those elements from that particular package. Is that correct or no?
No, you already you will have the skill to extract it. It's just that the manifestation product will be different because, you know, if you change the environment, you will change the result because the environment plays a part in the inertia product. You can't discount the environment. Like if I say ketchup, you know, what do you think? Oh, I'm going to put this nice sauce, tomato sauce on my fries, let's say, my French fries. Okay. So I'm going to put this ketchup on, and some of it gets onto your plate, and you don't wash your plate. The next day, it's hard as a rock. So what's your point of view? Are you the guy who's eating the French fries and leaving the dirty plate, or are you the guy who has to wash the plate? You say, well, it's ketchup is just ketchup. Yeah, but the ketchup I had yesterday was nice and soft, and it gave flavor to the fries, and the ketchup today is, you know, welded to my dishes. So
is
we
this what we were seeing in Beijing? Were we seeing the splitting of the neutron in a way behind the scenes or out of our physical view until it
no, we were seeing the inertia product.
Okay. So there was no splitting of neutrons or interacting that way. I'm thinking there was, but that's just my thinking.
You have both because we had a shielding which created the magnetical field, and we had the gravitational field, which was creating the absorption. You have to have both. That's the whole catch.
Plus a little time technology thrown in, hidden within the system. All right, anyone else? Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Gail, and everyone else who's contributed and been part of this process today. Any last thoughts, questions, comments, issues, exceptions that you'd like to bring forward? If not, I'm going to play the final disclaimer. The meeting will come to an end, and we thank you again for being here and hearing out this. Again, we're all holding a very small corner of a very large carpet, and we thank you all. And I think our work will become more prominent in the coming days and weeks and months ahead, as we'll all have a more of a distinctive role, I think, to play in this whole process, as humanity is at this point really blind to this whole energy dimension, and we'll start to introduce it to them. So we're in a way just in the training of it, and hopefully we'll be able to share that it's understandable by the others.
Well said, Mark. Thank you very much.